The clause was read aloud at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, and Elspeth Ainsworth understood, before the solicitor reached the second comma, that her uncle had already sold her. She kept her hands folded upon the black bombazine of her morning gown, precisely so, exactly as she had folded them since her father's coffin was lowered into the churchyard at Aldbury 3 months and 11 days ago. If her hands trembled now, no one in the panelled study on Bruton Street would notice. Sir Reginald did not look up from the seal on his signet ring. The provision was elegant in the way traps built by patient men are elegant. Upon her 24th birthday, 3 months distant, on the 1st of April, the Ainsworth settlement, her mother's dowry, and the sum in consols that had been hers in every practical sense since she was 16, would pass to her uncle in perpetuity, unless she were by that date married. He had chosen, for reasons that made sense, only at 3 in the morning, not to mention a single word of this to her. He had chosen instead a candidate. The candidate had teeth the colour of weak tea, and an estate that marched most conveniently with her uncle's own. There was a clause in a will that no one had thought necessary to mention to her. There was a stranger in a coffee room who could have refused her, and for reasons that made sense only to men who read the same paper twice, chose not to. And there was a woman who was, at this moment, folding her father's letters into the false bottom of a travelling case with the tranquil efficiency of one who has settled an account and is ready to leave. The London of February, in the year 1815, wore a low sky the colour of pewter that had been polished too often. Snow fell without commitment upon the formal gardens of Grosvenor Square, and upon the iron railings of Mayfair, and upon the shoulders of a young woman walking at a measured pace down Half Moon Street, past the flower girl who never had any flowers. Elspeth Ainsworth was 23 years and 9 months old, and her half-mourning gown was the colour of pewter as well, and her gloves had been mended at the seam of the third finger with a stitch so fine that only she could have found it. She wore her mother's small pearl at her throat and no other ornament. Her hair was the colour of dark honey when the light struck it, which the light rarely did, and her mouth had the expression of one who has been trained not to want anything visible enough to be denied. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, the city, the hour. I read every one. And if these stories of dukes and ladies make your heart breathe more slowly, leave a subscription here. It is my quiet way of knowing that you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in Regency England. All characters, names, and situations are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or events is pure coincidence. Elspeth did not weep in the carriage. Weeping was for later in the small hours, and only into the pillow her mother had embroidered with initials that were not hers. She had, in the 3 streets between the solicitor's chambers and the sign of the Blue Anchor, done a great deal of arithmetic. The arithmetic was the sort her governess had once called unsuitable for young ladies of quality, which was to say, useful. She had counted the pounds she possessed on her person, £147 and 11 shillings, in banknotes folded twice into the false bottom of her reticule, which was all she had been able to withdraw against her allowance before her uncle noticed. She had counted the weeks between this Tuesday and the 1st of April, 11. She had counted the men in London to whom she might, without dishonour, have applied for a private conversation upon the subject of matrimony. The count came to 0. She had counted twice in the manner of one who suspects herself of error, and arrived twice at 0. Her father had loved her, but her father had not been a man who kept friends. Her mother's family were in Yorkshire and did not answer letters. She had a governess who had married a chandler in Bristol, and a childhood friend who had married a curate in Devon, and neither of them could help her with what she needed, which was a husband before the 1st of April, and a husband who would not, once married, discover any of the several inconvenient reasons a man might have to interfere with a wife's fortune before she came into it. The coffee room at the sign of the Blue Anchor was of a kind the Tun did not visit, and the servants of the Tun did not either. It was, in that particular hour of the morning, half empty. A clergyman in a mud-spattered coat was reading, at the corner table, a pamphlet on the drainage of Hampshire fens. A man of business was arguing quietly with another man of business over a bill of lading. And at the window, with his back to the light in the way of a man who does not care to be seen but does not object to being noticed, sat a stranger in a plain dark coat, reading a newspaper as though the world had not tilted upon its axis within the last half hour. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32. His hair was very dark. His face was of the sort that would not be called handsome by anyone who had time to phrase the matter more precisely. It was a face that was arranged rather than composed, and it wore its arrangement with the expression of one who had settled long ago the question of whether it might be improved by rearrangement. His hands, folded upon the paper, were the hands of a gentleman who had at some point been permitted to use them. There was a very small scar upon the second knuckle of the left. His coat was plain, but the wool was the plain, expensive plain of a coat that had never known a cheaper cousin. Elspeth noticed all of this in the 4 seconds it took her to cross the room. She had begun, that morning at 11:15, to notice everything. "Sir," she said, seating herself uninvited across from him, "I require a husband before the 1st of April. You appear, to my untutored eye, idle. Are you also amenable?" He folded his paper. He did not smile. That would come later when she was not looking. He set the paper down upon the marble of the table between them and considered her from the other side of the table with the expression of one who had already calculated the cost of the interruption and found it, on balance, acceptable. "That depends, madam," he said, "entirely upon the terms." She had prepared herself for outrage. She had prepared, less consciously, for pity. She had not prepared for a man who negotiated, and the treacherous relief of it caught in her throat like a fishbone. From her reticule she unfolded the sheet upon which, in the hackney between Bruton Street and Half Moon Street, she had drafted her terms in a calligraphy that would have caused her governess to weep. Marriage of convenience, separation of person and interests, a settlement upon her in writing before the wedding of the sum of £100 a year drawn from her own future income. His engagement, in writing, to make no claim upon her fortune beyond what she might, from time to time, offer for the joint expenses of a household they would not upon any account share. A house of her own choosing in the country for as long as she wished it. And most particularly the courtesy of an annulment or a discreet ending of the arrangement, should she, upon coming into her fortune, wish to release him. He read them twice. He read them the second time more slowly than the first, which she chose to interpret as a compliment to the drafting. "There is a house in Berkshire," he said at length, "of which I am the tenant. It has stood empty since Michaelmas. It has a library that requires attention and a housekeeper who will be relieved to see a lady of taste. I would prefer, if you will permit the whim, that we take our residence there, at least until the summer. Is that agreeable?" "Berkshire," she said, "is agreeable. There is a further clause," he said, "which concerns yourself and not me. I ask you to agree in the same writing that you will not answer any question from any quarter respecting my private history for the first 6 months of our acquaintance. After 6 months, ask whatever you wish. I will not lie to you. Before 6 months, I ask that you not ask." She looked at him. She had been prepared at that morning's beginning to be looked at as though she were a problem. She had not been prepared to be a party to a treaty. "6 months is agreeable," she said, "so long as, at 6 months, you do not lie." "I will not lie to you," he said, and it was said in the tone of a man who has, at some other table, in some other year, made the same promise to a different person, and did not find the promise a burden. They were married on the Friday, by special license, at St. George's, Hanover Square. The clergyman had the polished courtesy of a man who has performed the office 6 times that week and does not intend to remember any of them. There were 2 witnesses, both of them strangers to Elspeth, and both of them, she noticed, more comfortable in the vestry than she was. He signed the register as John Winter, gentlemen. She noticed everything now, that the ink on the flourish of the W was already dry, as though the pen had been trained to it. She noticed that the sexton, when Mr. Winter passed him at the door, bowed rather deeper than a plain dark coat entirely warranted. She noticed in the carriage afterward that the coachman touched his hat to Mr. Winter with the exact fraction of hesitation which servants reserve for masters, whom they have been told, for the moment, to address as though they were not. She did not, in the carriage, inquire why. She had signed a treaty. She kept treaties. The road to Berkshire took most of 2 days. He rode much of it upon a bay horse the colour of good chestnut, which suggested to her that he had not always been idle, whatever her first impression. She travelled in the carriage with a maid he had, without being asked, arranged for her, a woman of 40 called Mrs. Bream, who spoke very little and packed a hot brick against Elspeth's feet each morning without waiting to be told. On the first evening they stopped at an inn near Reading. Mr. Winter took 2 rooms. He did not, at the door of hers, offer his hand or ask any question that would have required a treaty amendment. He said, "Good night, madam. I shall wake you at 7, if the weather holds." He said it with the expression of one who had already ensured the weather would hold. Havelock End was the name of the house in Berkshire. It stood at the end of an avenue of limes, with the winter branches making a black embroidery against the low sky. It had a stone facade of the Queen Anne century, and 2 wings, added later by a hand that had been almost as careful as the first. It had a pond in the west garden, with a Venetian bridge above it. It had a library that ran the length of the south front, on 2 floors, with iron balustrades wrought in the pattern of small climbing roses. The housekeeper who opened the door for them was a woman of perhaps 50, in black bombazine identical, Elspeth noticed, to Elspeth's own, with the expression of one who had been told to expect a mistress and was not quite easy in the newness of the address. "Mrs. Coombs," Mr. Winter said, "this is Mrs. Winter. She will be with us for some time. Whatever she asks of you, you will give her, or you will tell me why." Mrs. Coombs curtsied. She said, "Yes, your," and stopped, with the expression of one who has been reminded, by a small internal cough, of a rule of the house. "Yes, sir," she said. Elspeth heard the pause. She counted it. She did not remark upon it. She had signed a treaty. It is easy, in the retelling, to make the first month at Havelock End sound like a courtship. It was not a courtship. It was a country of 2 households under one roof. Hers on the west side, near the library, arranged around a small morning room with a bow window. His on the east, near the office of the estate, arranged around a study which she did not enter, and did not, in the first month, contemplate entering. They met at dinner. Dinner was at 7. Dinner was in a room with a table of walnuts so long that they sat at first at either end of it, until she asked on the 3rd evening whether he would mind if the servant set both places at the same corner, and he said without looking up, "I have been thinking of asking the same thing." And it was done. He told her, over the soup on their first evening, that the north lease was in arrears, and that he intended to see to it in the morning. She did not know what the north lease was then, but she nodded, and by the 2nd week she knew what the north lease was, and by the 3rd week she had opinions upon it, and by the 4th week she and Mrs. Coombs and the steward, whose name was Elphick, had, between them, taken the arrears in hand. He never entered her rooms. He never touched her hand, except when he was assisting her down from the carriage, in front of servants. And when they returned inside, he released it as though it were a document he had been asked to hold. In the library, in the evenings, they read, sometimes on either side of the fire, sometimes at either end of the long table near the window. He read history and estate accounts and one novel which he did not identify. She read her father's letters and her mother's letters, and at length a book of sermons which had belonged to neither of them, and was, she suspected, a plant. "Do you sleep, madam?" he asked once, upon looking up from an inventory of oak, and finding her still at the window at midnight. It was said with the expression of one who had asked the same question of himself, in the same room, at the same hour, more often than he cared to count. "Not always," she said. "Then I recommend," he said, "the conservatory. It is warm at all hours, the gardener sees to it. There is a bench between the orange trees. I have found it useful." "Useful for what, sir?" "For not sleeping in a useful place," he said, and returned to his inventory. She went, that night, to the conservatory. It was warm. The bench was there. There was, upon the arm of the bench, a small quilt of no distinction, folded exactly so, in the manner of one who had left it there for someone who might, later that night, need it. She sat until 3, and she did not weep, and it was, in that month, the first hour that had been entirely hers. There was, she began to notice, more of him than there was of him. There were, on the wall of the corridor to the office of the estate, 3 miniatures of children of a family she did not know, with an inscription beneath in a hand she could not attribute. When she asked Mrs. Coombs said, "Cousins, ma'am," and did not elaborate. There was, in the second week, a letter that came for the master of the house in a hand, and a seal that Elspeth, whose father had corresponded with a duke of the West Country twice in her lifetime, recognized as a hand which wrote to few people and expected an answer within the week. She did not ask. There was, in the 3rd week, a caller at the door, a stout gentleman in a serviceable coat, who was received in the study for 40 minutes and left without being introduced to Mrs. Winter. There was, in the 4th week, a package from a London tailor addressed in a copper plate that had spelled the direction more than once, to a name that was not John Winter. Mrs. Bream, who had brought the package to Elspeth's morning room by accident and taken it away with a curtsy so slight that it might have been a shrug, did not, that evening, offer any explanation of any kind. Elspeth did not ask. Havelock End had a chapel of its own, in a hollow between the limes, of the sort that the mistress of a house of a certain size was expected on Sunday to attend and to be seen attending. On the first Sunday of March, Elspeth walked with Mr. Winter from the west door of the house across the frozen lawn to the chapel, and there in the porch was the local clergyman, a man of perhaps 60, with a face that had been red for so long that no one, including himself, remembered its earlier colour, and beside him was a lady of perhaps 40 in a bonnet trimmed with black feathers that had been trimmed the year before with a different trim. The clergyman said, "Good morning, your," and at the small cough from the lady of perhaps 40, corrected himself, "Good morning, Mr. Winter." The lady of perhaps 40 curtsied and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Winter. Welcome to our parish. I am Lady Havelock's daughter. She is not well enough to come out today. I hope you will forgive the intrusion of calling upon you at the pew rather than the door." She said all of this with the expression of one who had been told to say it in exactly those words and had rehearsed them since Friday. Inside, in the pew reserved for the house, Elspeth knelt upon the embroidered kneeler her husband did not use, and folded her hands upon the ledge her husband did use and did not, at any point in the service, look at him. She did not need to look. She was noticing now with a system. The first Wednesday of March brought Mrs. Havelock of Havelock Hall in the village to call at Havelock End. Mrs. Havelock was a very small woman of perhaps 65, with the expression of one who had been the second daughter of an earl and had never quite let it go. She sat in the front drawing-room, which Elspeth had opened and aired for the occasion, and she drank her tea with the tiny, precise sips of a lady who has calculated the exact number of sips a call of that length required. And she said to Elspeth over the third of these sips, "My dear Mrs. Winter, we are all so relieved to have a lady at Havelock End again. Are you Berkshire, on your mother's side?" "I am not, ma'am," Elspeth said. "My mother was Yorkshire, Aire Valley, the Ainsworths of Aldbury." "Of course," said Mrs. Havelock, with the expression of one who had known this before she asked. "And your marriage? You must forgive an old woman, my dear. I was your husband's late father's second cousin. I take a family interest. Your marriage, we are told, was a matter of some quickness." "It was, ma'am." "Then that is very fine," said Mrs. Havelock, "for the best marriages are, in my experience, quick. My own was performed at Doncaster on a Wednesday, between two horses I had not seen run and one that had. My husband was killed at the Nile in a way that gave me the greatest pride and no consolation whatsoever. May I ask, my dear, what your husband has told you?" Elspeth set down her cup. She had, since Tuesday morning at 11:15, become a woman who did arithmetic in company. She counted the sips. She counted the seconds it had taken Mrs. Havelock to reach the question. She counted, from the third Sunday she had not been permitted to look at her husband, the pauses. "He has told me, ma'am," Elspeth said, "everything I have thought it useful to ask." "Then that," Mrs. Havelock said, with the expression of one who had, at that moment, decided to change her mind about Elspeth Ainsworth, "is the very best answer you could have given, and I shall tell his Gruor." And here she paused and looked at her cup and said, with the tiny cough of a woman who had made the identical error at the identical hour on Tuesday, "I shall tell his cousin when I write that he is a fortunate man." She departed 10 minutes later, leaving upon the salver in the hall a card that had, engraved upon its lower corner, the arms of a house Elspeth did not, in that hour, know how to read. In the library that evening, Mr. Winter was drawing a map. It was a map of the North Lease, ruled in ink, with the tenants' names written in a cramped, careful hand along the boundaries of their fields. "Mrs. Havelock called this afternoon," Elspeth said at the door. "Ah," he said without looking up. "Was she gentle?" "She was gentle. She is only gentle when she has decided in your favor. I am relieved." "She was gentle," Elspeth said, "and she twice used a form of address in respect of you, which she then corrected. So did the clergyman on Sunday. So did Mrs. Coombs upon our arrival." He set down his pen. He did not, at once, look up. When he did look up, he did so with the expression of one who had known, since Tuesday morning at 11:15, that this evening would come, and had, at 3 in the morning of a night no one had told her about, decided that when it came, he would not lie. "You have 3 months and 11 days, he said, "before you may ask me any question you wish. Will you wait?" She stood at the door. She counted in the corner of her mind that had been counting since February the ways in which he had not lied to her. He had not said his name was John Winter. He had signed his name as John Winter, gentlemen. He had not said in the vestry of St. George's that he was a plain man. He had said at the coffee room at the sign of the Blue Anchor that his idleness depended entirely upon the terms. "I will wait," she said, "the 3 months and 11 days. "Thank you," he said. He said it with the expression of a man who had, in a great deal of his life, thanked servants and secretaries and other men's wives, and had, in the years in which he had thanked them, come to reserve the word for very few. "Come and see the North Lease," he said. "I've been thinking that the western meadow is 9 acres larger than we have been paying rent upon, and that it belongs to us." She came and looked at the map, and with him they found the missing 9 acres. When she went to bed that night, the pillow which had, in the first weeks, been the small country of her weeping, was, for the first time in 3 months and 14 days, only a pillow. There was, of course, the letter. There is always the letter. It came in the 2nd week of March from Bruton Street in her uncle's copper plate. It said that Sir Reginald had been apprised of the marriage, that Sir Reginald was, of course, delighted, that Sir Reginald wished to be presented at the earliest convenience to the gentleman whose good fortune it had been to marry his niece. that Sir Reginald would arrive at Havelock End on the 24th of March in the afternoon, and that Sir Reginald had, in the interim, taken the liberty of instructing his solicitor to review, in respect of the settlements upon marriage, whatever documents Mr. Winter might see fit to produce. Elspeth read the letter twice, and folded it and carried it, still folded, across the corridor, and knocked upon the door of the study, which she had not in 6 weeks entered. He said, "Come," and she came, and put the letter upon his desk, and said, "My uncle." He read it. He set it down. He said, "Tell me about your uncle." She told him. She told him about Sir Reginald and the claws, and the 1st of April, and Mr. Foxall of Hertfordshire, whose teeth were the colour of weak tea. She told him about the 7 years of small requisitions from her mother's estate that had, when she totalled them at midnight in the 2nd week of March, come to the sum of £1,100. She told him about the cook at Aldbury who had been dismissed for taking Elspeth's part in an argument about the airing of blankets. She told him about her father's letters, which she had folded into the false bottom of her travelling case, and which said, in her father's careful hand, "I have done my best. I have not done enough. Be careful of your uncle." She had not, in 6 weeks, told any of this to anyone. She told it now, standing on the far side of a desk with a green baize inlay and one small, careful scar upon the corner of the leather. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not, when she had finished, offer any of the reassurances she had heard in the last 3 months from clergymen and family friends and men of business, which had all begun with the words, "My dear," and ended with the words, "Not to trouble yourself." He said when she had finished, "May I have this letter?" "You may." "May I answer it in your name, if I sign it in mine?" "You may." "Then," he said, "you have very little to do until the 24th of March, except to be at home in this house when your uncle arrives. Will you be at home?" "I will be at home," he said. "Thank you." He said it again with the expression of one who did not use the word carelessly. He did not stand as she left the study. When she was at the door, she said without turning, "Mr. Winter." "Madam, on the 24th of March, when my uncle arrives, will you be, when he arrives, the man he expects, or the man you are?" There was, from behind her, a pause. It was the pause she had begun, in 6 weeks, to be able to read. The pause of a man who considered his answers as though they had, in some other year, cost him a great deal. "On the 24th of March, he said, "I will be when your uncle arrives, whichever of them protects you better." She went out and closed the door and stood in the corridor a moment, with the expression of one who has heard the sentence she had not, until this morning, known was the sentence she was waiting for. Between the letter of the 2nd week of March and the appointed 24th, there fell the small season of Berkshire. The neighbouring county families, having established that Mrs. Winter had been received by Mrs. Havelock and had not disgraced the pew on Sunday, decided to invite her to what they called their little sittings and their evenings and their assemblies. There were 3 of these before the 24th. Mr. Winter attended 2 of them. He did not dance at either. He stood with the men in the room where the men stood, and he spoke in the low voice of a man who preferred that no more of his words than necessary should travel, to men of business and clergymen and the 2 magistrates of the neighbourhood. When Elspeth came into the room in which he stood, he moved with the expression of one who has been counting the seconds until he might, so as to walk her into supper. He did not, at any of these evenings, put a hand upon her wrist or her waist. He put his hand under her elbow once, as they went down the shallow stone steps of a house near Sunning. She noticed that his hand did not shake. She noticed that her own did. At the last of these evenings at Sunning, there was a young lady. There is always in these stories a young lady. She was blonde and small and very pretty. She was called Miss Vin Willoughby. She wore a gown of the palest possible blue with a shoulder knot of the palest possible silver ribbon, and she had, from the moment Mr. Winter entered the room, the expression of a young lady who had, at some earlier date, been given to understand that certain expectations were to be met. She was introduced to Elspeth by the hostess with the phrase, "Our dear Miss Willoughby, who has been so kind as to come down from town for the fortnight, and who is, I believe, an old acquaintance of your husband's family." And Miss Willoughby curtsied to Elspeth with the exact fraction of grace that the daughter of an earl reserves for the wife of a gentleman about whom she has not, in the last month, been given precise information. "Mrs. Winter," said Miss Willoughby, "I am charmed. I've been so eager to make the acquaintance of the lady who has, in a manner so decided, altered the plans of half the town." "I regret," said Elspeth, "any inconvenience to the plans of the town." "Oh, we shall recover," said Miss Willoughby, with the smile that was too small to be quite a smile. "The town always recovers. I am pleased at any rate to see that Mr. Winter is himself well. He was very ill in November, was he not?" She said it, this last, with the expression of one who was asking a question to which she was certain of the answer. Elspeth had not, at any point in 6 weeks, been given to understand that Mr. Winter had been very ill in November. She had noticed, on a shelf in the study, when she had brought her uncle's letter, a small silver medal of the sort given in some regiments for surviving. She had noticed, one morning at breakfast, that his hand had rested longer than necessary on the coffee pot, as though the porcelain had been an old comfort. She had noticed in the pew on Sunday a habit he had of holding the corner of the hymn book with the second knuckle of his left hand rather than his thumb, and when she had permitted herself to look at the knuckle, of the small scar upon it. "He was," Elspeth said. "He is much recovered. Thank you for asking." "And the estate," said Miss Willoughby, with a smile that had grown smaller still. "One hears such very odd rumours about the estate. Have they been so much as they have said?" "The estate," Elspeth said, "is very well, thank you. From the far side of the room, the other side of the room precisely." Mr. Winter looked up and looked at his wife, and with the expression of one who had, in 6 weeks, learned her posture at 3 distances, came, without hurry, to the little group in the corner. He bowed to Miss Willoughby. He bowed with the exact bow of a man who was not at that moment going to be either colder or warmer than the room strictly required. "Miss Willoughby," he said, "I did not know you were at Sunning. Only for the fortnight, Mr. Winter. I am pleased to see you well." He did not at any point look at her hands or her mouth or her ribbons. He turned with the small, precise turn of a man who had trained himself to it, and said, "Madam, they are calling in. Shall we?" At the supper, he sat beside her. He did not at supper address Miss Willoughby, who was seated to his left, and would have preferred that he had. He addressed, instead, on Elspeth's right, a magistrate of Reading, upon the question of the drainage of the Kennet, and on his own right, the wife of an admiral of Portsmouth, upon the question of a cousin who had been to Baltimore. He put his hand once on the back of Elspeth's chair. He did not put it upon her. In the carriage home, he said, "Miss Willoughby has come down from London for the fortnight." "So I gathered. I would not have asked you to endure her this evening had I known." "I did not," Elspeth said, looking at the window. "Endure her? I noted her." "Ah," he said. There was, in the pause that followed, the small, dry sound of a man who was, with the expression of one who did not in general do so, on the point of laughing. "You have the makings, madam," he said, "of a very dangerous wife." "I have the makings," Elspeth said, "of a very careful one." He did not answer that in the carriage, but when he handed her down at the door of the house and turned her for a moment so that the light of the lantern fell upon her face, he said, "There is in Miss Willoughby's history and in mine an old family arrangement. It was never a serious one. It has, since the year before last, been entirely closed. She has not, on any competent authority, been given reason to believe otherwise. I did not intend to speak of it before the 6 months. I speak of it now because I would rather you noted, in her, the wrong thing than the right thing. Will you accept that on my word, without asking the rest until the day? I will, she said. She said it before she had herself decided to. Yes, I will. Thank you, he said. And that was the third time, in 6 weeks, and she had begun to count these too. The days shortened toward the 24th of March, with the quiet menace of a countdown. The gardeners cleared the drive of the last of the ice. Mrs. Coombs had the great drawing room aired. The steward Elphick was, at Mr. Winter's request, briefed upon every acre of the North Lease and every shilling of the accounts. There were that week 3 letters delivered at Havelock End by a rider in a plain livery who did not come to the house door but to a side entry off the stable yard. Elspeth saw one of them upon a table in the study when Mr. Winter had been called out, and did not read it, and did not, when he returned, pretend she had not seen it. She said, "There is a letter." "There is a letter," he said. "I will show it to you if you wish." I do not wish until the day, but I wish to have said aloud that I saw it. He said, "You are a scrupulous woman, Mrs. Winter." He said it with the expression of a man who had been raised, from the age of 5, in a house in which scruple had been a thing the servants had and the family did without. On the morning of the 23rd, the day before Sir Reginald was expected, a second carriage arrived unheralded at the front of Havelock End, and out of it stepped a lady of perhaps 45, in a gown the colour of a Yorkshire moor in September, with a black shawl and grey gloves, and the expression of one who had come, on business, from a great distance, and would remain until it was concluded. Elspeth received her in the front drawing-room. She said from the doorway, "Ma'am, I am Elspeth Winter. May I know how you have come to call?" "Mrs. Winter," said the lady, "I am your Aunt Prudence Ainsworth of Otley. Your mother was my sister. You will remember, perhaps, that I did not, at your father's death, come south, because I was myself unwell. I have, in Yorkshire this week, been informed of matters which have caused me to become at once perfectly well. I have come to be tomorrow at your side. I have brought in that other carriage your mother's papers, which have been in a chest in Otley since the year before you were born. I have in my reticule a letter of introduction from the vicar at Otley, which you may read at your leisure, and which contains nothing you do not already know. May I sit down?" Elspeth sat down first, and then her aunt, reached across the low tea table and took her niece's hand and held it, without speaking, for a full minute, in the manner of a woman who had, for 23 years and 9 months, been meaning to. "How did you know?" Elspeth said, when her aunt released her hand. "A gentleman of my acquaintance," said Mrs. Ainsworth, "who has business at times in these counties, wrote to me at Otley 3 weeks ago, and said that he had lately, in the pursuit of matters he did not name, encountered evidence of a settlement made upon my niece, which he found unusual. He asked me, as an act of family, to come south, and, if I found the case as he suspected, to be at Havelock End on the 24th. His hand was unfamiliar to me. His seal was not. Your mother had in her chest a letter with the same seal, written to her at the time of her betrothal to your father, by a person who then was, and who now is, a person of some standing. I do not, my dear, ask you to interpret this. I ask you to be at breakfast on the 24th, and to permit me to sit at your side, and to permit your husband to say what he came into your life to say." "Aunt," said Elspeth, "if you know already, will you tell me now?" "I will not," said Mrs. Ainsworth, "tell you now. I keep my treaties, my dear, like your mother did." And she looked at her niece with the expression of a woman who had, in 23 years and 9 months, decided that when the day came, she would, in this small matter at least, do it right. At dinner that night, Mr. Winter greeted her aunt with the very small bow of a man who had been long acquainted with her by report, and not at all in person. He said, "Mrs. Ainsworth, you did me the kindness of coming. I am obliged." Aunt Prudence Ainsworth of Otley curtsied, a full curtsy, of a depth that made Mrs. Coombs at the door of the dining-room close her eyes for a fraction of a second and said, "Sir, it was not a kindness, it was a duty. I hope tomorrow to be permitted to perform it." They ate. They spoke of Yorkshire. They spoke of the North Lease. They did not speak of Sir Reginald. When Elspeth went up to bed that night, she found upon her pillow a folded piece of paper in the hand of the man who had, in 6 weeks, never sent her one. It said, "Whatever tomorrow requires you to hear, you have already, since the 1st of February, been the one who caused it. Do not, in any of tomorrow, cease to be that woman. J." She kept it. She did not, that night, weep. She had in 7 weeks forgotten the pillow was for weeping. Sir Reginald arrived at 3 in the afternoon on the 24th of March in a barouche of hired horses that had been driven too hard. He came into the great drawing-room of Havelock End with the expression of a man who had been to a solicitor upon the way, and who had, in the solicitor's chamber, taken his stand upon a matter which he did not, upon this floor, intend to yield. Behind him, in a coat that had been let out at the shoulders more than once, came Mr. Foxall of Hertfordshire, whose teeth were the colour of weak tea. "My dear niece," Sir Reginald began before he had entirely reached the fire, "you cannot conceive of my astonishment at the news of your marriage. It is, I am sure, a very fine thing. It is, I am sure, a marriage upon which the family may look with the utmost satisfaction. But you will forgive an uncle. You will forgive, as it were, a man in loco parentis, for a certain solicitude respecting the arrangements. It is a solicitude, my dear, which the estate lawyers are, I am afraid, obliged to share. I have brought with me Mr. Foxall, whose acquaintance you will recall as an act of family, that you may consult with him upon the—" "Sir Reginald," said Mr. Winter from the far end of the room, in the tone of a man who was, in his own house, going to speak once and not again. "Will you sit down?" Sir Reginald sat down. He sat down with the small internal recalculation of a man who had, until this moment, believed the room would be his. "May I have the pleasure," said Mr. Winter, "of introducing you to Mrs. Winter's aunt, Mrs. Ainsworth of Otley, who has come south upon the family's business. May I ask Mr. Foxall to wait, if he will, in the hall, until my wife and I have finished with her uncle." Coombs. Mrs. Coombs appeared in the doorway with a promptness that suggested she had been standing on the other side of it. "Sir, Mr. Foxall will take a glass of Madeira in the hall. See that he does." Mr. Foxall did not take a glass of Madeira in the hall. He was walked out by Mrs. Coombs with the expression of a man who had been walked out by the housekeepers of larger houses than this. "Now, Sir Reginald," said Mr. Winter, and he sat down himself at last in a chair with a back so straight it did not accommodate him, and folded his hands upon the arms, and looked at Sir Reginald with the expression of one who had been briefed. "I have read the clause of your late brother's will, upon which you have of late relied. I have taken advice upon it. I have taken it from a gentleman whose opinion is not, as I believe you understand, generally set aside. I have, at his suggestion, also caused my own solicitor to review the settlements made upon my wife at the time of our marriage upon the 6th of February. Mrs. Winter's fortune is, by those settlements, entirely her own. It cannot pass to me. It cannot be claimed by any relative of hers upon any pretext. Any suit brought against the settlements will be defended from the first hour by my counsel and by the counsel of 2 gentlemen who are, in this matter, willing to appear alongside them for reasons which are their own. I mention this only that you may not, in the exercise of your affection for your niece, take steps you would afterward regret." "Mr. Winter," said Sir Reginald, and here, for the first time, his voice was thinner than it had been. You speak with a great deal of confidence for a gentleman upon whom, forgive me, I have not until this day made inquiry. I do, said Mr. Winter. You will have made inquiry upon me, I am sure, upon your journey. If upon reaching London you find that the inquiry has come home more richly than you supposed, I ask you to understand that my wife did not, on any day since the 1st of February, know it. She married a man in a plain, dark coat. She married him for the reason a woman marries a man who has calculated a clause of a will she was not told about. She has in this matter entirely clean hands. I do not require you to praise her for it. I require you to leave her alone. There was, in the room, one of those silences of the country houses that country houses use in the place of the servant's pantry cough. It went on for a matter of 6 seconds. Sir Reginald looked at his niece. His niece looked at Sir Reginald. Sir Reginald had never, in 23 years and 9 months, seen his niece look at him. "Elspeth," said Sir Reginald at length in the tone of a man attempting to withdraw with dignity, "I hope you know that I have in every hour of my care for you considered only your future welfare." "I hope I do, Sir Reginald," said Elspeth. She said it very quietly. She said it with the expression of one who had, in the 7 weeks she had been Mrs. Winter, learned that quiet was a country in which she was welcome. "I have, upon your care, no observation to make. I would ask only that any further care be transmitted, if you please, by letter to my aunt at Otley, or to my husband's man of business in Lincoln's Inn. I shall receive callers at Havelock End, only such as I have invited. I hope you will forgive me. My morning has been long." She rose as she said it. She had, since 11:15 on a Tuesday morning at Bruton Street, been rising from a chair only when it suited her. Sir Reginald rose with her. Mr. Winter rose. The whole room, in effect, rose. Aunt Prudence at the corner of the fire did not. She watched her niece rise with the expression of a woman who had come south from Yorkshire at last to see it. Sir Reginald and Mr. Foxall departed from Havelock End at 4. It was a wet afternoon. The wheels of the barouche made a sound upon the drive of the sort that servants who have been long in a house pretend, when the master is in the hall, that they cannot hear. Mr. Winter came in from the door. He said to Elspeth, "Will you walk with me?" She walked with him. He put his hand under her elbow once on the step from the drawing-room to the terrace. He released it. They walked in the west garden, past the pond with the Venetian bridge, past the little iron bench where a Havelock daughter had, 70 years earlier, kept her doll. It was cold. It was very quiet. He said, "You may, if you wish, ask me the questions now." "There is 1 week to the 1st of April, she said. "I said I would wait the 3 months and 11 days. I shall wait the 8 days more." He looked at her. He looked at her with the expression of one who had, in the great mixed weather of a life lived among strangers, learned to notice on rare mornings a stubbornness that reminded him of an old friend. "Very well," he said. "In 8 days you may have all of me you want. Meanwhile, will you tell me one thing that is not a question?" "I will." "Tell me," he said, "why you came into the coffee room at the Blue Anchor on the 2nd of February. Why that coffee room? Why that morning? Why that man?" She stood at the parapet of the little bridge. The pond below was still frozen at the edges. She could see on the black water in the centre the reflection of 2 people whose posture, in the reflection, was not that of a married couple. It was the posture of 2 people who had not yet, in any usable sense, decided. "I came into the coffee room at the Blue Anchor," she said, "because it was the closest coffee room to Half Moon Street, to which my uncle's servants had never followed me, and in which my father had, on one occasion, been seen. He liked it. He said the coffee was bad, and the newspaper was worse, and the clock told the wrong time in a manner one could rely upon. He said it was, therefore, the only honest room in Mayfair. I came into it because I remembered him. I came in because it was warm." He said nothing for a moment. He said at length, "That was well answered." "And the man," she said, "was the man I sat down opposite. I did not choose you. I sat down opposite a plain dark coat because a plain dark coat was, at that hour of my life, all I could afford. If you had refused me, I should have gone to the next table." "You would not," he said. "You would have gone home and drawn up better terms and come back tomorrow." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because," he said, "on the 23rd of January, in the same coffee room at the same table, you sat, madam, opposite a man who was reading the same paper. You did not, that morning, speak. You had, that morning, not yet decided. I know this. I know it because I was, on the 23rd of January, seated at the next table in the corner, watching who came in. I know it because I had been asked, by a person to whom I could not refuse a favor, to watch at that room, at that hour on that morning, for a young lady of a description very like yours, upon a matter in which I had at that hour no other interest whatsoever. It has become since, upon the terms we drew, my one interest. If, when you tell me you did not choose me, you mean that no one who chooses is choosing, then, madam, I do not agree with you. I will not, in 8 days, agree with you either. Come inside, it is cold." She did not answer at once. She could not for a moment answer. She had been, in 7 weeks, a woman who counted. She was now a woman who had been counted. Above the pond, a rook of the great rookery at the top of the limes cried once, in the tone of a magistrate. "Come inside, Mrs. Winter," he said again. "The 8 days will pass." They passed. On the 31st of March, at 10:30 in the morning, a rider brought to Havelock End a plain letter addressed to Mrs. Winter, in a handwriting that Elspeth did not recognize, and that was not, upon reflection, meant to be recognized. Mrs. Coombes, in the small breakfast room, laid it upon the tray beside her coffee cup. Elspeth opened it. It said, in 6 lines, "Madam, your aunt of Otley has been today informed in London of certain matters respecting Sir Reginald, which will, upon her return to Otley, be laid before you. Your husband, whom I have the honour to serve, is at present in your library. He begs the courtesy of your presence there at any hour you please. He asks that, at the moment of your entering, you be prepared to hear him call himself, aloud, by a name which is not John Winter. He hopes that you will bear it. He hopes that you will not, upon hearing it, mistake it for anything but what it is, the small, personal, plain fact of who has been in this house at your side since the 6th of February. I have the honour to be, madam, your obedient servant, H.M. She read it twice. She rose. She did not, in the corridor between the breakfast room and the library, quicken her step. She had taken, in the course of 7 weeks, to walking a great deal more slowly than she had ever, in her life, permitted herself before. He was at the long table near the south window, with the winter sun laid, at last, in a proper March slant across the wood. The library that morning was clean. It smelt of beeswax and faintly of the orange trees from the conservatory beyond. He was not reading. He was sitting, quite still, with his hands folded upon the polished walnut in the posture he took, she now knew, only when he had, from 3 in the morning, been preparing something. There was, upon the table between them, a small object she did not recognize, a signet in gold laid flat upon the wood. He rose as she entered. He did not, in rising, offer her his hand. He looked at her from the other side of the long table with the expression of one who had for 3 months and 11 days, and for a great many years before that, been ready, in principle, to be looked at without a title. "Madam," he said, "will you sit?" She sat. He sat. "The name upon the signet," he said, "is Adrian Alister George Ravensmere Ashcombe. I am, upon the death of an uncle, whose funeral I did not attend in the December before last, the 6th Duke of Ravensmere. The house in which we sit is upon a lease of 21 years made in the year before I was born. mine, and it will, at the expiration of that lease in 1836, revert to my cousin, whose father was the 5th Duke. The property to which I properly belong is Ravensmere Court in Northumberland, which I have not, since the day of my uncle's death, visited. The reasons for that are neither honourable nor dishonourable. They are private. I will tell them to you now, if you wish. I hope, if you do not wish, that you will let me tell them to you in an hour of your own choosing, before the summer. She looked first at the signet, then, at length, at him. You told me you would not lie to me, she said. You did not lie. You did not tell me the whole truth, and I did not ask for the whole truth. I signed a treaty. I ask now only one question. Did the person who asked you to be in the coffee room at the Blue Anchor on the 23rd of January know who I was? He did. He is your Aunt Prudence's cousin, in a manner of speaking. He is also mine. He wrote at Christmas to Otley and to Ravensmere the same day. He asked one of us to be at the Blue Anchor. Your aunt could not come. I came. And you had, she said, on the 2nd of February, decided already. I had, he said, on the 2nd of February decided nothing. I had decided on the 23rd of January that if you did not come again, I would send to Otley in the spring. When you came in on the 2nd of February and sat down opposite me and read out your terms, I had, in the 7 seconds between the moment you sat down and the moment you said idle, decided, madam, everything of consequence I have decided in my life. Adrian, she said. She said it with the expression of a woman who was, in the last hour of a treaty she had kept for 8 weeks, permitting herself at last to try a name. May I still call you Winter, in the house, until the summer? You may call me, he said, whatever you like in this house or out of it forever. There was, from the far end of the library, the small sound Mrs. Coombes made when she was trying not to be heard through a door. There was, in the winter sun on the walnut table, a fine dust that had in 7 weeks settled and been polished away and settled again. There was, upon the arm of the chair he was sitting in, one of her mother's shawls, which he had, without asking, brought in from the morning room for her that morning, because he had noticed in 6 weeks that she was cold at 11. Mrs. Coombes, Elspeth said, without looking away from him, will you come in? Mrs. Coombes came in. She had the expression of one who had known, since a certain evening in early February, that this morning would come, and had, at 3 in the morning of a night no one had told her about, decided that when it came she would, in the small matter of the tea, do it right. Bring us, Elspeth said, the tea, if you please, in this room, and ask Mrs. Ainsworth to join us when she comes down, and find out, in the office of the estate, whether Mr. Elphick has, this morning, the map of the North Lease. I should like to look at it with his grace. There is, I believe, upon the western meadow, a matter of 9 acres that we have not yet, in the tenancy, entirely accounted for. Your Grace, said Mrs. Coombes to Elspeth, with the expression of one who had, for 8 weeks, been rehearsing a form of address, and who was, at last, permitted to use it. Not yet, said the Duke of Ravensmere from the other side of the table, with the expression of one who had, for 8 weeks, been waiting, and who could, in this matter, afford another quarter of an hour. In a quarter of an hour. First, the tea. Yes, sir, said Mrs. Coombes, and went out. Elspeth sat at the table. Her husband, she was going to have to reform herself in the course of the summer to the use of that pronoun, sat opposite. Between them, upon the walnut, in the winter sun, lay a signet in gold, with a name engraved upon it in a hand she did not in fact need to read. Behind her, upon the arm of a chair, lay her mother's shawl. Beyond the south window lay a pond, with a Venetian bridge above it, and above the pond the black embroidery of the winter branches of the limes. In the drive, in a few minutes, would be heard the wheels of an aunt's carriage returning from the village. And there was, in this room, on this morning, a treaty that had, upon the 1st of April, been at last completed, and a small quiet thing beginning in its place that was, at 3 in the morning of the nights to come, going to require of both of them a great deal more courage than either of them had, until this hour admitted to possessing. He said at length in the tone of a man who had not in a great many years said such a thing aloud, "The conservatory is at 16 degrees this morning, madam. If you should wish to come back tomorrow, I have asked the gardener to keep it so until noon." "I shall be there in June, your grace," she said. She said it with the expression of one who had in 8 weeks learned to say what she meant with the fewest possible words. "I shall be there tomorrow as well." "Then that," he said, "is very fine." She returned after the tea to her book. The rain that had, since the morning of the 24th, been threatening, began at last, quietly upon the pond. Stories told with a serene love. A letter without a date arrived, bringing a weight that the autumn had kept, a debt, a name that the town had feared, of which no one understood a word. She folded her fear in silence, chose the road that no one wished to see. It was thus, without promising anything, that two strangers met in the cold. He, the man that London had judged wrongly. She, the woman who had learned to trust again. A clause in a will was read one Tuesday, and a young woman went to a coffee room to write her own line. A stranger folded his paper and did not smile, and the world that morning agreed to be rewritten. She folded her fear in silence, chose the road that no one wished to see. It was thus, without promising anything, that two strangers met in the cold. He, the man that London had judged wrongly. She, the woman who had learned to trust again. If stories like this keep you company at night, leave a comment and a subscription. That is what makes them go on being told here. This is a work of fiction set in Regency England. Any resemblance to real persons or events is pure coincidence.